Hello and welcome to another episode of Oh What a Lovely Podcast, where popular culture meets the First World War. I'm Angus Wallace, and with me as ever is Jessica Meyer and Chris Kempshall. In this episode, Jessica and I talk to Andrew Powell-Thomas, the editor of Over the Top, a First World War history magazine aimed at children, which is published by the Great War Group. And after that, we're joined by two readers of Over the Top, aged 9 and 10, to give us their thoughts on the First World War and the magazine. Can we describe them as avid readers, Jessica?
That might be pushing it. I'm not sure that at least one of them is an avid reader of anything. So it's not the magazine in particular. But they certainly engaged.
Yes, they did read it and give us some feedback. But first, let's get started with Andrew Powell-Thomas. We begin by asking him how he got started writing.
I used to be a primary school teacher, 14, 15 years in that. Then the writing bug got me, as it were, and I started writing kind of children's books, and that took off. And then from that, kind of indulged in my history passion, my hobby, as it were, and started to write local history books. And again, that kind of took off. So yeah, I kind of run the really interesting line, the gauntlet of children's books and kind of, grown up non-fiction. And for me, it works. There's obviously so very, very different styles to write for.
But actually, what we're talking about today isn't children's books so much as a children's magazine that you edit, Over the Top, which I'm interested in hearing about how you got into children's, teaching children about the First World War in particular. But actually, I'm wondering, is editing a magazine very different, do you find, from writing a book? And how do you get there?
We've got a lot of very, very good writers, a lot of really good contributors for Over the Top magazine. And it's, fantastic when the email pings and they've sent their article through for the next edition. And you're reading, someone who is incredibly knowledgeable in their field of the First World War, reading what they've written. And then, again, the old teacher comes in, and this is probably a really good skill to have going into the editing of, you're just that fine-tuning, that missing full stop. It's, that comma that's just been left, all those like little pedantic things that when you're in the throes of writing something and you're in the mood, it's very easy just to miss those out. For me, it's a great extra thing to do. And, I think more, as importantly, it's that idea of it's just moving along and getting this, what we think at the Great War Group, is a fantastic little magazine for children, hopefully helping explain to them what the Great War was all about, what it was. And, that's the kind of the whole premise of why we created it.
How do you choose which topics to address in the magazine? It's not necessarily themed, is it? Each issue isn't themed. So how are you choosing what's to go in?
Well, that's one of our the biggest discussions we had at the start was whether to have a theme for each edition. And we kind of thought, well, that's got its merits, but then if that's not particularly your thing, then that might switch you off for that edition. And we kind of wanted to make sure we had something for everyone in there. The focal point for us each edition is the graphic novel that we have in there, which is 15, 16, 17 pages long on a particular person from the Great War and just telling their story. And some of them are well known. Some of them are, really well known. Walter Tull, for example, it's a reasonably well known story, but actually kind of put it into that graphic novel, it kind of breaks it down for children and makes it an easier read for them. They're still getting all the factual information. They're still getting all the knowledge about him, his life, what he did. But it's just in that graphic novel style with the illustrations, just kind of makes it that easier to digest.
I'm really interested by the range of individuals in there, because one of the editions that I've been sent has King Faisal as the central figure. The Middle East isn't particularly the theatre that I write about anyway, but not someone who I knew a great deal about as an individual. The name was familiar, of course, and a rough sense of his significance. But yeah, I think, there's a huge range there, isn't there?
Yeah, one of the things that we had, and this was one of the keys to the First World War and talking about the Great War, is almost like the phrase of, it's not just the Western Front. And I think for a lot of people, and I dare say a younger me included, you think about the Great War and you think about the Somme and you think about Flanders and perhaps you don't really go beyond that, and I think for us that the key was to, obviously tell those stories, but those have been very, very well told already. So it's incorporating the fact that it was a world war, it was, fighting was taking place in lots and lots of places, and perhaps places that people don't really realise. So we've kind of we came up with a 2-year program initially of kind of key people we wanted to mention. Both sides of the conflict as well. I think we're quite good at incorporating, the fact that it was, people on both sides suffered, people on both sides lost, and that's a really important aspect to emphasize to that next generation. For the general public on both sides, they were suffering the same things. They were suffering loss and heartache and devastation. But yes, certainly as far as that main graphic novel, we try to incorporate. We've got a fantastic list which is kind of just growing of just very different people, just people you've kind of maybe heard of, and in some cases people you haven't heard of, and it's hearing their story which is incredible.
But Mata Hari was the one that sort of went, oh, that's an odd one to put in a kids magazine. But actually, when I handed my two to my daughter, the one that I found her reading was Mata Hari. Which I have to say, I really like the graphics for it too. I thought the graphics, the text all worked really well together with that. But I'm not sure, going back to my own childhood, the children's history of the First World War would have actually touched on Mata Hari at all, because it was all about kitten heroes.
And again, that stereotype, that image of the Western Front, isn't it? That's that stereotypical image of what the Great War was. And having worked in education for a long time, children like to be told the true story. They don't really want a watered down version. Children are clever enough to, want the real facts. And, I think we do it in a very kind of delicate way, but also making people understand that your children reading it understand that, people were killed during this conflict, and, people suffered a lot of heartache. But those different stories, very different stories, like you said, it's not just about the rifles in the trenches. There are other stories out there to be told.
Being an academic, my antenna go up at truth and facts, and going, but, there's a lot of nuance there. And and particularly around some of the topics you cover, a lot of different perspectives and a lot of academic investigation. These are still topics that are being investigated and researched. It's not that there's a solid narrative of history, which of course is not necessarily what you need to tell the audience that you're trying to address here. I suppose my question is really about who the experts are you're asking to write this, and how you negotiate, for experts going, but it's more complicated, and what sort of negotiations you have to do to say, yes, but this is what our audience needs.
With any expert in a field, obviously they are passionate about their subject. So it's almost, unpicking it and saying, right, I know you could write 25,000 words on this subject. Can you give me a 1,000-word answer? And it's that's the tricky bit. I think the key is for the audience, it's, bearing in mind, we are aiming for children, but it's that crossover from kind of year 5 upwards. So you're kind of going into the teenage years where, and again, children growing up now, very different to when we grew up. They're a lot more worldly wise and a lot more understanding of what the real world is like. So I think from that side of things, it's that idea of don't cut details out if it's integral to that story. We want to give them the true story as it is now. So I think from that side of things, it's kind of keeping it down to a readable amount for young people. And I think hopefully then, particularly for thinking perhaps those 15, 16-year-olds who are picking up the magazine and reading it, if they read something in that article that then makes them think, oh, that's interesting, they're naturally going to go out and do their own research then and find out additional things. And part of the thing we're trying to do is almost like give that, give us that overview of that particular subject, whatever it is, whether it's about a particular weapon that was used, and tell us that overview of it, and then people can dig into that deeper a little bit further on. It is very difficult sometimes, kind of cutting down a lot of knowledge into something that's quick and readable. And again, it's finding that balance for children of not talking down to them as well. It's talking to them face to face. Vocabulary. You don't need to change the words, children are naturally inquisitive. If you put a word in there that they don't quite understand, they'll ask what it is. They'll go, what does that word mean? And it's the same in any subject you teach in a school. If you dumb it down all the time, that's what they'll get used to. Well, actually, we want children to use vocabulary and exciting vocabulary and scientific and technical vocabulary. So it's keeping those words in, and then if it just needs an explanation at the end of the article, then brilliant, you drop that in. As far as our kind of experts are concerned that we use, or our article writers, we're obviously within the Great War Group. One of the ideas behind it starting up was the fact that anyone's contribution is welcome. Everyone has something to add to the conversation, and that's really good. We've got some really good writers in there. Alex Churchill, obviously, she contributes an article every edition. Bethany as well, who does an article. We try and include like a child soldiers article in every edition, just to emphasise to the children that actually some of these people who were fighting weren't any older than you guys reading it, kind of thing. And people lied about their age to go and fight. Would anyone do that in this day and age? So Bethany, who she's a tour guide, and she writes that article. We've got Jim Smithson, again another tour guide, written a lot of books, who offer to do an article every edition in there. And we're also working with the Commonwealth War Graves Commission as well. So in the last couple of editions, they've provided an article for us, and I've got a plan with them as well to incorporate them telling their story, because I think with the Great War, for lots of people, it might just be seeing that grave might be their only link to the Great War, and it's kind of understanding what the job that the Commonwealth War Graves Commission do, the different sites they've got, the different jobs that they have. And again, working with them, you can ask for a bigger or better expert in their field to write for the magazine. So, it's a great range of people that we've got writing for us. They all do it voluntarily as well. They're all in it for the greater good, as it were, of educating the next generation. And I think that's one of the biggest things from this magazine is the fact that we're right on that cusp now. I think with the Great War, is obviously there's no one alive now that fought in the Great War, and it's actually just re-educating that next generation and making them realise what happened just over 100 years ago. Obviously, the theme of remembrance, where the poppy comes from, the whole idea of all these things that are part of British culture now, they originated from the Great War, and it's a really important moment, to pass on that knowledge to the next generation.
You actively go into schools as well as doing the magazine. So what I'm intrigued by is when you're writing for the kids. If you're writing a football magazine, kids understand football, they know football, there's a sort of a cultural knowledge around football. When you're writing around the First World War for kids, how much knowledge do you have to tell them? Because it's so far away, not just for them, probably their parents, and perhaps even their grandparents, know not that much either. So you're kind of coming from a cold start, other than perhaps some poetry, depending where they are in their education. And it's not even represented much on TV and film. And increasingly, even Remembrance Day, it gets a mention, but other conflicts sort of have subsequently taken over. So I wonder how difficult it is when you're looking at a magazine to sort of judge what needs to be in and what doesn't need to be in, to explain to a kid of what's happening.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think, obviously the Great War of its time, there's not as many photographs, video compared to the Second World War, and if you come more modern conflicts, obviously it's instant, isn't it? What we're seeing happening in the world now, it's instant coverage of what's going on. So you're absolutely right, there is that issue, and there is that difficulty, not just for children, for adults as well, I think. Like you said, I go into schools a lot and kind of talk about, I do author workshops and the rest of it. Remembrance Day is usually the big in with regards what schools will already cover with their children. Certainly primary schools, secondary schools, they will talk about Remembrance Day, they will mention it. I'm thankfully usually very, very busy around that end of October, beginning of November time, going into primary schools and doing workshops about Remembrance Day. For me, as I've done that over the last few years, that's the good starting point, because children know we've got the poppy, but they don't necessarily know why we've got the poppy as that symbolism. And so obviously, when I go into schools as an author, I obviously do the shameless plug of Over the Top magazine and get the schools on board and interested into it, and the children. And as I said, I go into schools, I talk about remembrance, the poppy, why we've got the poppy, the history of the cenotaph, the idea of war memorials. War memorials are also I find a really good way of engaging the children, because, as we know, pretty much every settlement in the UK has got a war memorial. There's very few thankful or doubly thankful villages that, in the country. So everyone's seen their war memorial in their village or their town. And again, it's just emphasising, that's, people who went to your school, that perhaps they lost their lives. And I think with any of these kind of conflicts, it's trying to break it down, certainly for children, to break it down to that personal level as well, which is why we think with the graphic novel, focusing in on that one individual kind of makes it more real. And as I said, certainly from my point of view, when I go into schools, you're talking about millions of people having been killed. Even as a grown-up, that's hard to place, isn't it? It's hard to contemplate, it's hard to understand. Whereas when I'm in schools, we break it down into kind of talking about the whole, and then you break it down to one individual. And I kind of think gradually building up, some World War I artifacts that I take in with me, and kind of build this story up of a soldier whose medals I've got. He was in the Devonshire Regiment, and he was killed, and kind of building up that from those millions and millions of people. Actually, when you break it down to an individual story, and that's someone's dad or that's someone's brother or husband, for the children, that becomes quite real then. It becomes quite a real story, and they're able to understand it. So I think, breaking it down to that individual level, even when we talk about in the magazine, we're doing an article on weapons. Well, it's just one weapon. You can't talk about all of them in one go because there's so many. So actually, it's just focusing in onto those one, and hopefully then over time that gradually then builds up that knowledge and that understanding.
How much do you envisage talking about aftermath and legacy? Because I'm thinking, you've talked about war memorials and death, but of course you have more men coming back injured or ill after the war and returning to these communities, and these are communities themselves changed by war. When we were doing the centenary commemorations, one of the stories that we picked up on as part of our public engagement was things like children collecting eggs to take to hospitals, and the role that this is a total war. Children were involved. There's some fantastic pictures of 5, 6, 7-year-olds dressed up to do fundraising events, to sell flags on Flag Day, all this sort of children's involvement in the war that then, shaped their lives afterwards.
It's part of our list of things. Like I said, war memorials are a good starting point on that. Yeah, I kind of know what we've got coming up for the next 2 or 3 years, really. I kind of got that far. And it's trying to get the mix. It's trying to get that balance of those different stories. Because as I say, we don't just, you mentioned before about there's not necessarily an individual theme to each edition. But you're absolutely right. I think it's certainly when I do my talks with children, it's the idea of where the poppy came from, the poppy factory, and it was the fact it was giving injured servicemen a job. Because again, in the world that the children now are growing up in, they're old enough and they're clever enough to understand that if you can't get a job, then there's some support there for you, from the state. And actually, that back then that didn't exist. When you tell stories, to children of servicemen selling their medals for the silver content, to get that money to help provide for their family. And you have children go, well, why would they do that? It's like, well, if it's a choice between your family having something to eat and not, that's what you would do. And as a dad, that's what you would do. And yet now, us looking back on that seems horrendous, doesn't it? That they would go down that route. So almost like the easy option is to you remember those who were killed. I don't mean easy option in any derogatory way, but it's talking about the men that were killed, but it's actually those who have come back with trauma, isn't it? That's the other story, and the impact that they had when they came back. So it's on the list that we're going to kind of, that we're going to cover and talk about. Because again, it's just as important a story as the rest of them.
I was going to ask about writing for kids. You find you have to. The phrase that I had in mind was tabloid sensationalization, but I wondered if you find yourselves do you find writing for kids to get them hooked in? Do you have to kind of overstate to get them reeled in, or can you lay it out differently?
If someone's interested in the topic, they're going to pick it up and read it anyway. So it's actually the ones who are on that borderline. Those are the ones that you're trying to drag into your book or your publication in this case. And for us, as I said, the front cover of the magazine, it's got that graphic novel. So even those children who perhaps don't have that genuine interest or passion for the Great War, the graphic novel grabs the attention, whether it's the Red Baron cover and you've got that illustration of the plane, or whether it's John Cornwall and whatever it is. Hopefully that grabs them in. You're certainly right that for children's writing as well, layout is important to kind of grab the attention and keep the attention. Again, we've all read many books aimed for adults, and sometimes out of necessity, that the layout and the design needs to be no frills. It needs to be bog standard. Here's your mass amount of text. Whereas for children, it's slightly differently. The layout is important. There needs to be some eye-catching bits. There needs to be photographs. There needs to be diagrams to help explain it. And I think the key, and I would dare say maybe grown-up books need to incorporate this a bit more, but a picture tells 1,000 words sometimes. And actually, by having that diagram or that picture, you can kind of get that message across, really, really well to children.
Well, I suppose there's always a danger with images. And I say this having just tweeted yesterday something about some idiot on Twitter put up a picture of some flappers and some serious misinformation about there being no diets in the 1920s. And having tweeted out, have you never heard of William Banting? Who's a 19th century health specialist. Particularly a few years ago on Twitter, there's quite a lot about, misattribution of images. And, one of the things that we're quite concerned with once we get students in university is talking to them, particularly in the first year, but right through to dissertation research about if their interest has been sparked, where they can go and look for more information. Because I suppose, as an academic historian, you're saying that, yes, brilliant and enthusing kids, but do you give any guidance as to where they can go to find reliable information? Because there is a lot of misinformation. And I know Lucy Betteridge Dyson every sort of year or so goes on and says, no, that picture is not a picture of the commemoration of the horse in the First World War. Yes. That once a bit of misinformation is out there, it's really hard to counteract that.
The flip side to that, having worked in primary schools, year 5 and 6 children are being told the importance of your source. Not everything on the internet is real. You need to check, double check and triple check. Again, when I get to go in and do visits, you kind of emphasize this, using images is an absolute minefield. You've got to make sure you've got the correct permissions and everything in place. So, I mean, we do that from that point of view with the magazine. You mentioned Lucy, with that horse picture. I mean, you're absolutely right. That comes up time and time again. Someone's just copied and pasted it, put a tag to it, and she usually shoots them down quite well. She's actually doing an article for us for our next our August edition. I mean, certainly as far as kind of more information is concerned, one of the things that we're looking at is perhaps having like a book list incorporated into the magazine as we go forward. As you said, it's finding that information and finding good quality information and knowing that it's trustworthy. And so, that's certainly something that we're looking at is, having that in the back. I have had schools contact us direct as well, saying, this was a really good article. The children were really interested. Can you give us more information? So certainly, our email addresses are in there to get in touch. So certainly when they do that, we're able to then, email them back, put them in the right place. As I said, I think part of this Over the Top magazine, again, it's making the Great War knowledge digestible for children. And again, that's that year 5, so then 10-year-olds up to 15-year-olds, kind of that kind of bracket. where they're perhaps not necessarily going to be ready for reading the grown-up Great War books. And so we're trying to, I mean, certainly I think, that there's a gap there. There is this gap that this magazine's hopefully filling, just to, stem their interest and get that knowledge out there. Those children that are interested and have that passion, they will go out and they'll find the right answers anyway. But it's those who are on the cusp, who just believe everything that they see on Facebook, or their parents believe everything they see on Facebook, and then they take it as gospel.
It's not so much as a sort of uncritical belief in social media. It's more, I did a first year strand of a module, which Angus then went on to teach again for me. And I don't know, Angus, I think you had a slightly similar experience with these students of going in and saying, so what do you know about the First World War? And getting in my case, it was little black squares on Blackboard that, just a whole lot of blanks and silence. The interesting thing for me was pushing, well, what do you remember of the centenary commemorations? And none of them, a few of them had done projects in school, but that was about it. None of them had been involved with the government-funded battlefield tour stuff. I think the age was slightly off. It was a different year group that had gone for most of my year. But you had a slightly similar experience, didn't you, Angus?
Yeah, none of them had anything, and it was you were too far away from the centenary for them to remember. I was amazed at how little cultural baggage they had with them about the First World War. So when I pilfered the trench art that we have at my mum's, they didn't know what it was, and they didn't even recognise that the vase was made from an artillery shell. It took them 5 minutes before someone eventually said, "Is this some sort of artillery gun bullet thing?"
But I think, there's sort of a generational shift. I find that surprising. I'm of an age to have two youngish children myself, and I come from the States where the cultural baggage is very different. But I think there's a big generational shift about the extent to which we assume that the First World War is part of our cultural hinterland just to begin with. And I'm not sure that's true for children anymore.
No. I mean, it's a tricky one. I mean, certainly as a primary school teacher with my primary school hat on, Remembrance Day is done in every single primary school. It's that annual thing, and it's usually done really, really well. But I think, like with any kind of topic, unless you've got that teacher in a school who has got that interest and is going to grab the subject by the scruff of the neck and drag it through because they've got that interest in it, it's a hard one to kind of focus in on, isn't it? It's a tricky one. I mean, all I would say is if every school books me in for a school visit, then I can sort all these problems out. Because one of the big things that I do, and Angus, it goes back to you mentioned about that trench art, it's taking in artifacts, it's taking in actual items and not just telling children that it happened and not letting them see a photograph of it, but actually letting them hold and feel this was a shell, this is what it was about, and letting them see these different items and hold them. There is something in primary schools which came in, don't quote me on this, but like maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and it's the British values concept. And so part of primary schools, part of the curriculum that children are developed with is British values. What is it like to live in Britain? What values do we hold? Democracy, debate, respect, all those kind of key words. And schools generally do that really, really well. They tell the children, they discuss almost on a weekly basis about these words, what it is to be democratic and everything like that. Part of that is remembrance. Part of that is the poppy. But again, it's that tell someone once, are they going to remember it again in a year? They're probably not. It's that regular kind of drip feed that they need, isn't it? To kind of keep them aware. And I think you're right. I think I mentioned earlier that we're on that cusp with the Great War. The last 10 years and the next 10 years of, because there's no one alive now who experienced it to tell the personal story, their own individual story. It's kind of very easy to kind of almost just put it into the mists of time.
I think it actually gets back to a point that Angus made about the shifting focus of Remembrance Day, because I'm just thinking about the Strictly Come Dancing, because this is my daughter, passionate Strictly fan, will watch every episode on iPlayer.
You're completely distancing yourself from being a Strictly fan. It's like, what, maybe?
No, I am something of a Strictly fan myself, but I don't watch them over and over again during the course of the year on iPlayer. that includes watching, there's always the Remembrance Day, the Remembrance Sunday week because of when it's scheduled. And they go out and they talk usually to the RBL and current recipients of services from the Royal British Legion, and focus on contemporary conflicts or very recent conflicts. But the dance itself is very often sort of grounded in historical imagery. And it's always Second World War. And it's always, the swing music and women in service uniforms or, 1940s clothes. And it drives me absolutely insane. It's done so for a number of years.
Like you say, it's probably because that's been shown, isn't it? Like culturally in films, isn't it? And it's been that GI coming for a dance kind of thing.
But I think Strictly's been going on long enough that the fact that's what they did from almost from the start. They did have a couple of years right at the beginning where they sort of evoked the First World War. And I think that's been a major shift. That Remembrance Day it's about all 20th century and even into the 21st century conflicts. And it's not the poppy as a symbol of the First World War in quite the way that I think it was even 10, 15 years ago. And I think there's a broader cultural shift that's really, to take the burden off of schools. I don't think we can put the whole burden onto schools. A lot of us come to our interest in the First World War not from what we learned in the classroom, but from picking up a novel or watching a television program or a film or picking up a magazine and getting excited that way.
There's a big question here about how do you delineate between the First World War and the Second World War to kids, because I know my daughter gets frightfully confused about which is which. Now, it doesn't help that she has a granddad who is in the Second World War and a great-granddad who was in the First World War and a great-great-granddad who was in the First World War. So they're all kind of, the generational thing all starts to overlap. And she gets frightfully confused about the timeline of that early part of the 20th century. I would say, how do you delineate between the First and Second World War for kids? Or do they understand it?
From that point of view, the magazine is straightforward. It's First World War, it's Great War. So if it's Second World War, I totally get what you're saying about the Second World War. Again, I think culturally there's been so much written about it. I think probably because of technology and everything else, there's so much more recorded from the time, isn't there, of the Second World War. Those images and the film from the Second World War, they're just much more widely available than where we were for the Great War and the First World War. The knowledge of what the poppy was intended to represent originally, it's absolutely got lost in the last 25, 30 years. And it's great that it's used as that symbol. But again, that historical, originally it was for, and kind of it's trying to emphasize that. It's a tricky one. As I said, I think that the difficulty that we've got for that next generation, which is the whole point of the Over the Top magazine, is it's just that having that knowledge, having that understanding, or knowing where you can get some of that knowledge from if you're interested in it, which is hopefully what the magazine ticks in. I mean, like we mentioned, photography, photographs from the Great War, they can be very, very few and far between. Sometimes but for some of the child soldiers that we're researching and trying to find, it's like there's no known photograph of that child. They've been recorded as having fought at 14 years of age or whatever it was, but there's no known photograph. So it's tricky sometimes. Whereas Second World War, you can pretty much almost guarantee if you're writing about a certain area of that, you're going to be able to find a photograph of it somewhere. Jessica, you mentioned about the idea of that being inspired from reading novels and all that. I think, for lots of children, actually, they need to read more. They need to read a variety. And as that goes back full circle, you read a book and that was interesting. Then you find out it was set in a real place and that event really happened. And then that's where your own interest goes, isn't it? And that's where you go off as a child and you find out, you get your non-fiction book, then you find out about it and you kind of build up to it. And I think we're kind of trying to fight that aspect to it. whether it's for this, whether it's for the Great War or any other kind of subject that's kind of been lost.
In the spirit of plugs, my own personal children's book favorite for the First World War, Kate Saunders did a wonderful The Five Children on the Western Front, which I think really captures E. Nesbitt's voice. I really love. But actually, Hilary Mackay, The Skylarks' War. I adored that. I thought it captured a children's eye view of the war, which I think, going back to Over the Top and that idea of getting your readers to really associate with well, what might their experience have been like if they'd lived back then, and making the past not another country, but somewhere where they might have lived.
Yeah, and I think, again, talking about getting children especially to empathise with the main character, isn't it? And making them, as you said, making them think, well, what would I have been doing? And one of the regular articles we've got is like a home front article. So it's not just about the hero who won 3 medals or whatever it was. It's not just about this weapon or this type of vehicle that was used. We've also then got this aspect of home front of what was happening at home during this time. So, like toy manufacturing and, food and munitions factories and all those kind of things that are a bit more, well, actually, if we went back 100 years now and plonked us as a group of children into this is what your daily life would be like. This is what this is the impact that it would have had. Yes, your dad would have been off fighting, but your mum would be doing this as well, and you would be. And that idea of again, breaking it down from this thing that happened a long, long time ago with all these grainy black and white photos and actually realising it, they did have colour back then as well. It's just the photography that was... Because the number of children who kind of think that the past is, it was all... They had grey clothes. No, they didn't just have grey clothes. They had colourful clothes, just like we do now. And again, breaking that down and making it, what would it be like for you? What would it have been like for you back then? And it just makes it more real then. If you're a 14-year-old girl and there's a story about a 14-year-old girl in the magazine, okay, wow, that could have been you. We're not talking about a 28-year-old man or fighting, but, it's trying to get them in that's relevant for them, I think, is the key.
So there we are. That was Andrew Powell-Thomas. If anyone is interested in getting a copy of the magazine, you can find it at greatwargroup.com. Now, we wondered what children not directly familiar with the First World War took from Over the Top. So we press-ganged a couple into reading it. We start by asking the kids to introduce themselves.
I'm Katie and I'm 9.
I'm Pippa and I'm 10.
Shall we look at the magazines?
Yeah.
Which magazine do you want to look at?
This one, because this one's my favourite.
Katie, you tell us which one is your favourite.
This one is The Life and Times of Manfred Baron von Richthofen.
That'll do. And which one have you got, Pippa?
Prince Faisal. Faisal and the Arab Revolt.
And why did you choose that one? What's the best bit about it?
The word search at the end.
Katie? Did you do the word search at the end?
I've done a bit of the word search in here, but I've not drawn in it. I've just thought it
So
out.
Why did you choose The Life and Times of Baron von Richthofen?
Because there's a story about him in it. I really like it because there's a dog in it.
There was an animal thing that you liked, wasn't there, Pippa?
Yeah, I like the animals on the back.
Oh, yeah. There's a little letter thing at the start of this one from a mule called Montague.
Did you both read the graphic novel in the middle?
What was that, the one in this one about?
John Conwell, when he was younger, and all about his brothers and sisters and family.
Were you more interested in the brothers and sisters than the war bit?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, judging I was reading it just before bed.
Did you find it scary before bedtime, Katie?
No.
I thought you didn't want to read one of them before bedtime.
Yeah, but I didn't realise it was not that scary.
What did you learn about the Baron, Red Baron? Why did you like that one over the Matahari?
1, because it has a dog in. 2, because it's more interesting.
What did he do, the Red Baron?
Well, he started off in the British cavalry, I think, or is it the German cavalry? In the German cavalry. And then he went on to be in the Air Force.
Uh-huh.
And he... where is it? There he is. And his plane got shot down when he was 25.
And which war was that?
First World War, I think.
Just checking.
Pippa's found something else she liked about the Jack Cornwall story.
I like the poem near the end. I think it's about his mother asking where he is.
What's it called?
My Boy Jack. It's written by Rudyard.
So why do you think it's his mother talking?
Because it says, "Have you heard any news of my boy Jack?" And it could be the father, but I think it's more likely the mother. Because I don't think Dad would say that. Yeah.
Because we're not told either way, are we, who's talking?
No.
Why do you like the poem?
I like it because it repeats not on this tide, it repeats this tide.
You like the rhythm?
Yeah.
Do you think the artwork's important to help you like the story?
Yeah, I think so, because if you didn't maybe like the artwork, you couldn't see what it was in pictures.
Did you read those stories because are those the best stories because they have the artwork rather than the other ones that have loads of words to read?
Yeah.
I don't like the words to read either.
I prefer it with more pictures. Like that one only has one picture, so I don't think I'm going to read that because it looks really boring because it only has one picture.
About the Anzacs, only has one picture. It only has one picture on the double-page spread, so you don't want to read it.
No.
So which ones did you read?
The women's football during World War I and Franz von Hipper.
Who was Admiral Franz von Hipper? I've never heard of Admiral Franz von Hipper, can I just say?
Perhaps Germany's most daring admiral.
Is he in charge of the fleet that attacks Scarborough?
Is that Jutland?
Jutland. What did you like about the women's football?
I liked how it told us how it progressed during World War One.
And where are the women's football teams from?
It just says one of them, which is
The Dick Kerr ladies from
Preston.
So, Katie, I noticed your magazine keeps returning to the same page. What do you want to tell us about that page? I presume you quite like it. What's the article that you keep finding and opening?
It is the one on this gun called the Hippo. It's called the Hippo because it's meant to be the size and weight of one. And it was 6 tons. It's a gun. And I think it was the people who lived in Italy. They pulled it up to the top of a mountain so they could fire it off everyone below. And then when the war ended, they left it there, and it's still there today.
Why do you keep coming back to that article then?
Because I like it.
Why do you like it? What did you find interesting?
The fact that the gun is still there and it's not rotted away.
Did you two girls know that they fought the First World War in Italy?
I learned about that in you.
Did they?
Yeah.
All of that?
No, some of it.
Okay.
I think it was World War II that they fought in Italy.
Ah, you knew that World War II was fought in Italy.
Yeah, we did that this year.
You did World War II at school this year?
We did World War I at school this year.
Did you?
Yeah, we did World War I, I think. When was Winston Churchill Prime Minister? So it was World War II then. We learnt about World War II.
Have you two learned anything about World War I in school? Do you think you remember?
Yes. You came into school.
Yes, I did. But what do you remember? What were you learning about?
Someone in World War One.
Walter Tull.
Oh yeah, I was learning about Walter Tull.
What do we know about World War One?
Nothing. Is this a magazine?
It's
about
magazines or World War One.
Then I know everything in this magazine
Everything
is
in this
about
magazine. Did you find an interesting fact from the magazine? I don't know if anything had just struck you and you thought, God, that's interesting, I'll remember that.
Something did in this one because it shows you how to write a diary for the First World War, and I did that when I was in year one.
Whose diary is it?
Henry someone.
Henry?
It says Henry. Oh, Monty.
Or is that Monty the Mule's? It's Monty the Mule's diary checklist.
I was looking through this and I wondered how important do you think the pictures were, and do you think the pictures were relevant or well selected for what you were reading that made you want to read the articles? Because when I was your age, I was a bit lazy and just looked at the pictures and didn't usually read anything.
The one about women's football, I think that does represent it.
What type of picture are they?
They are the actual pictures that were taken. They're photographs.
Did you prefer the photographs or the drawings?
Drawing.
Do you prefer photographs or drawings, Katie?
the drawings.
Why?
Well, for the article on the Red Baron, I feel like they're really good. I think they're better than they would have been if they were pictures.
What would you like to learn about if you were to ask the magazine what you...
I'd change, where is it? the article on Old Faithful because it mostly talks about magazines and it doesn't even mention the word Old Faithful once.
Do we know what Old Faithful is?
No.
I think in this one about the Prince
Faisal.
I don't think I'd change anything. I'm not sure. Let me have a look for it.
Anything else you'd like to add? Well, any other thoughts about the magazine?
I like this article.
You like that article? What's that article? Go on, explain what it is.
About two people who earned medals for really good things during the war.
And what medals did they win?
Noel Godfrey?
Shabazz, I think.
What did he win?
Oh, the Victorian Cross.
And what did he do to win that?
Fight in the war. I've forgotten.
You've forgotten. But did you enjoy reading about his exploits?
Yeah.
When you flicked through the magazine for the first time, did any of the titles, like the names of the stories, did they actually sound exciting that made you want to read them? So you read Mata Hari first. Why did you read Mata Hari?
Well, it was the first magazine I picked up, and it was an article about somebody, so I just read it. Just
because it was an article about somebody, you didn't see the title and think, what's that all about?
Because the title is Mata Hari, and I don't even know what that means.
Okay.
It means something in German. I'll find it. It says it's the military word for sun.
Malayan.
Oh, Malayan. I thought it said military.
I have the deer. So do you think the magazine is better than Harry Potter?
Probably the magazine because it has more pictures.
What about you?
Harry Potter because it's a lot more interesting.
I think Harry Potter's more interesting than the First World War.
I think it's probably more amusing than the First World War.
So Chris, you weren't there for either of those.
Yeah, I think I contributed a lot to this episode. Some people may be listening to it going, it's almost like Chris wasn't even there when they recorded these. But of course, that's just madness talking. You know, I would never, have other plans when we had recordings and that going on. So I think I brought a lot to this, and I reckon the recording will bear that out.
So what did you get to it all as the impartial listener? Is the First World War more interesting than Harry Potter?
I mean, yes, I definitely think it's more interesting than Harry Potter. But then, my primary two interests are the First World War and Star Wars. So whether or not I'm in a position to comment on popular culture from my glass house and stone emporium about what other people might find interesting. I mean, it's always interesting with these to find the bits that people hook onto when they're reading. And it was genuinely fascinating to find the areas that both of your daughters kind of latched onto in the magazine, but also even like in passing that the way that the two world wars has kind of blended into each other in regards to what they get taught at school and where they kind of position them in their heads. And I think we kind of get slightly too kind of railroaded and niched because, this is what we do for a living into, we have clear dividing lines between all of these historical events. And, clearly in the way that they're taught and received in school, they just sort of blend into one.
I did wonder if their children will be taught more about that sort of the idea of a second 30 years war as they get really distant from it rather than two distinct wars, because they do smush them both together and it's quite difficult for them to tell it apart. I mean, that might be different in 5 years' time, to be fair.
I also wonder how representative our two girls are in some ways, because I know that not just my daughter, actually, but my son has a much better sense of the First World War as a distinct conflict because they know that's what I study and I don't do the Second World War. So yeah, my 13-year-old is apparently doing the First World War next year, and we have all the fun of him coming home and asking him for help with his essays. I have a feeling
people say parental indoctrination doesn't work.
It's interesting as well. You're right. What the kids latch onto. It's funny why did you like the Red Baron article? After reading it all, it was because it had a dog in it. I mean, the dog's not even at the start of the article. It's halfway through the article is the dog. But the dog's the bit that gets mentioned.
And the animals on the back cover. Those cartoons are quite good.
I mean, to be fair, not just children's animation. That's attention. That's basically like a review of Twitter. Why did people like things on Twitter? Because there was a dog in it.
Pippa's reading of My Boy Jack was interesting because they just thinking it was from the point of view of a mother. I
was fascinated by that. Kipling fan that I am, I have never introduced her to that.
And when you've read it though, Jessica, whose voice was it? Were you hearing?
I've always assumed it's a man. I first encountered it by a Kipling. I read Stalky and Co. and The Jungle Book and Plain Tales from the Hills before actually I sort of engaged at all with the fact that his son fought and died and the epitaphs of war. And I love the epitaphs of war. I find them fascinating and quite complicated. But yeah, I've never interpreted that as any other way than a father talking about his son.
Funny, I thought I was the same. It caught me by surprise. Just presuming it was from a mother.
Yeah. And actually, I think it's Mark Connelly in his book on London memorials, East End London memorials, and his discussion of the memorials to Jack Cornwall. Jack's mother is a huge figure in that memorial movement. So it's actually not a bad interpretation, I think, if you go back to the history of the commemorations of Jack Cornwall. I was very impressed by my daughter, I must say.
It's interesting how it is, I guess it's a magazine, so it's all about imagery, but the imagery was important for them to get hold of. The article with too many words in and no pictures on Anzacs completely was overlooked.
And the photographs weren't that interesting, which they did seem to quite like the illustrations, though.
I think as Andrew draws out, it's quite, from a period which only has so many photographs anyway, it's quite difficult to represent, which could be again why you look at the Second World War and it's more visually appealing, because there's more idea of the war photographer and people going out and taking interesting pictures in the home front.
I wonder if there's the black and white element to it.
It's the they shall not grow old effect. By adding colour, suddenly makes it seem real and interesting and vibrant. Whereas, none of that footage is new. Peter Jackson didn't create any of it. It was all from various documentaries. And then suddenly it's colorized and everyone finds it fascinating.
Well, that idea of the olden days, I thought was quite an interesting idea as well, where when you look back and you've got the olden days, which is when mum and dad were young, which obviously is nowhere near either wars. So that the timeline, there's no sort of timeline for them, at which point my only thought for the magazine, if you're listening, Andrew, is perhaps some sort of visual timeline to help explain fix kids in time what is happening, because it's so bizarre. It's just, it was sometime in the past.
I don't think it would make any difference. Somebody put something on Twitter, I think you were talking Twitter this morning about, or possibly Facebook, but the same amount of time has passed between 1970 and today as had passed between 1918 and 1970. As a child of the 70s, not 1970, I should say, but of the 70s in general, that takes some getting my head round, as an adult and as a historian who thinks in terms of, timelines and historical difference and continuity and change over time. For a child, they're just not going to grasp that. The past is another country. And they do things differently there.
It's funny how you can't rely on kids read. I mean, admittedly, we've found two kids and given them the magazine and told them to read it, and it's not as if they have a background interest knowledge that they're bringing to it. So I cannot at all rely on any form of implied knowledge, and you really have to state the obvious. And
they're also, I think, a little young for the target audience, because I think, and unfortunately, my son has school exams coming up, so really didn't want to be distracted by non-essential learning. In his view, it's a pity that we couldn't talk to him. He's 13, and I think that's sort of almost the target age group who might have encountered the war through school and want to learn more about it. Because I think, did Andrew say it was 10 to 16 is the age range they're aiming at?
Yeah, I think so. So we're right at the bottom of that age range. So when Katie's getting bothered by that, didn't know what Old Faithful was by the end of the end of the article. Although, to be fair, there was a picture of a rifle at the top of the article, but she never made the leap of faith.
With your son, Jessica, once he's survived his exams, we should get him to play a First World War computer game and then come back and see what he got out of it.
I think that would be very much up his street. I'll put him in touch with you, Chris.
Very good. Have you got anything else to add, Chris? Have we mined everything for this episode?
I think so. Yeah, I thought it was great. I say that like I wasn't there. I thoroughly enjoyed participating in every stage of the adventure.
So what are we looking at next, Chris? I can't remember if we're on kids' books or we the Red Baron.
I think we're going to basically spin the wheel on that and see what what we end up with. It will either be kids' books or Snoopy as the Red Baron.
We still need to pin down our guest is the long and the short of it, I think.
Or guests.
But we could just, we could keep dangling the opportunity that next month it'll be Snoopy as the Red Baron over our listeners almost indefinitely.
We will get there eventually. The fugitive guest for that one is very keen. It's just finding the right time.
But we're building hype and suspense. It's the perfect marketing tool.
Curiously, after this episode, I have a 9-year-old who's quite keen to read Snoopy and the Red Baron book. I've been reading. She spotted me. Can I read that, Dad?
I don't know how much Biggles will come into this, but at some point when all the academic work of this point in the year is done, I'm looking forward to burying myself in Biggles for a bit.
Very good. So if that's it for this time, I'll see you all soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Bye.
Oh, 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 it's a lovely walk. Oh, we walk with eggs and ham when we got plum and apple jam. Comfort, Richard, how can we spend the Olivia? Oh, 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 it's a lovely walk.